This window is taken out of a house that was built in about 1900. And they were taken out about 7 or 8 years ago. They're painted with linseed oil paint. They've only been painted about 3 times. 1, 2, 3. 3 layers of paint. Nice hinges. I'm going to take them apart, tighten up the joints, scrape off the paint and put new glass in. I'll be making paint as well, so removing the old putty. It's pretty simple. It's certainly been re-puttied at some point. It looks like perhaps even the glass has been replaced at some point as well, because some of these glazing nails are more recent. The small parts of damage, I'll take each of these pieces of damage separately as its own little chapter, so to speak, and decide whether or not to do anything, what kind of repair, if it needs any repair or not, or whether for something like this, for example, which is just a little split. Now I think that could probably just be glued and clamped, but if there are worse pieces than this, I will consider just putting in a new piece of wood. To take out these old screws, I'll replace those with something fairly similar, and then maybe plug the holes and re-drill them. Just lightly scrape. It's a nice thing about windows that haven't been over painted. The old paint gets slightly brittle. Linseed oil paint, it oxidizes continuously, as it's a kind of never-ending process really. That's the reason why 500-year-old oil paintings are cracked, because the oxidization process never really ceases and the paint gets slightly more brittle as time goes by. Now my customer has wanted originally to buy new windows, but I recommended them to rather buy these ones from me, or at least pay for me to restore them, because the wood that's in these old windows, I don't know if you can see it, but just at random, just take one of the pieces of wood and you can see that the growth rings they're about 7 or 8 in the middle. I can't even count those ones because they're so close together, but I mean there's probably about 10 growth rings per centimetre, maybe 15. And it's typical for this period that the windows were really displaying a culmination of knowledge that had developed over a couple of 100 or 300 years. And it's a time when people who were producing windows like this might have very well been professional window makers. So there would have been a lot at stake for them to produce a product that people instantly would recognise as being high quality. And in those days it was general knowledge about the quality of timber, unlike now where it's become a kind of specialist understanding. But 100 years ago, really, I think that the general people in population in Norway were very aware of what constituted good material, good quality material, and what didn't. So it's very hard to find anything new that would compete in quality with this. And although they're old, one might think, oh, well, it's old and dry. And the fact is, that just isn't true. Areas like this part here, which have obviously not had paint on them for a long time, have suffered damage in the fibres. The glue that holds the fibres together is slowly weakened by ultraviolet light, and that's what makes the fibres fall apart. So you get this pitted surface where the autumn wood stands proud of the summer wood, because the autumn wood is slightly stronger for the growth in the autumn. But as soon as you cut under the surface of this, you go back to what just looks like modern timber. I mean, there's just no difference. As soon as you get a few millimetres under the surface of that, probably only 1 or 2, you'll be into what looks like completely fresh timber. So don't be fooled by what looks like it's rotten on the outside. You know, it's just not. In this case, there's no rot in this at all. I mean, there might be rot at some point, but this particular window doesn't have any. And that is because the material is just the right quality level to handle being a little bit wet at certain times of year. And the paint is diffusion open, so the window, if it does get wet, it's allowed to dry out. And ironically, this kind of cracked surface, although the window does get wet when it rains, because of the cracks, it dries out very quickly. The cracks at the same time, or at least the paint, shades out the fibres underneath, stopping the sun getting them. And really it's the sun that does the most damage on the outside of windows. And if you put too much paint on them, they'll rot from the inside. Put the wrong kind of paint on them as well, which I've talked about in other videos. Right, I'm going to get on with my work now and carry on with this video at a later date. That to happen. That's the screw broke off in the hole. It's a bit annoying. Okay, so that someone has already drilled out those and put in new pegs. These pegs I'm taking out now are the ones that hold the corners together. I'll make new ones of those. Here I can see that the windows have, can see exactly how much damage from the sun that these windows have had. So I mean they've not been painted for some years. because had they been painted, the sun wouldn't have reached the fibres, and they wouldn't have it wouldn't have been damaged in any way. You know, the UV light wouldn't have come to reach the fibres, and they wouldn't have loosened and fallen off. So you can kind of measure it, and the rule is that it's about a millimetre every 10 years. So these windows haven't been painted for about 15 or 20 years out of their 100-year life in the house. So I need to take out that pin there and just drive out. If it's good enough, I'll just use it again. So this is the inside. You can also see how many times the interior was painted. I can see that this top coat is linseed oil paint, and there's one coat underneath. So it's had one coat for most of its life, and then another one on top. So there you go. That shows how people painted things in the past. 2 coats in 100 years. Just as well to keep this quite clean, because I think that judging by the age of this, it's very likely that this is lead based paint, lead white. This is boiled linseed oil. Slightly different situation here. The original paint, very, very thin, Empire style with a kind of grey, beautiful duck egg grey colour, grey-green. It looks like maybe there's even a bit of a kind of sandy colour underneath that. But then up on top of that, at some point, well, there's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 layers. I wonder whether these windows here are much older, this frame, and then these parts in the middle here are new. Not sure. Anyway, at some point this has been a large amount of caulking has been used. Linseed, what's that in English? Linseed oil putty has been used and mixed into the paint. So it's a very thick layer. And I don't really want to have to scrape this. I mean, if you can see, I can scrape a bit of it off, but some of it is quite sits quite well on the surface, and I don't want to risk ripping up the fibres of this wood too much, so I'm going to just use a little bit of heat to soften it. Well, I'm not trying to make it boil or anything, I just want to soften it. just going to clamp. It doesn't take very much heat to do it. I mean, obviously these crystals are very hot, but if I left it there for too long, I would just burn that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to burn the fibres. I just want to soften the paint very slightly. Like this one, it's called the Norwegian. It's got some damage. There's a peg there that's broken off. This peg at the other end has a little bit of has had wet rot at some point. There are some cracks in the fibres at that point there. There's also some damage to this part here, and worst of all, it's very curved, the piece of timber, the piece of wood. So I'm going to make a new one of those. It's not worth just repairing the damage. I could have done that, but in this case it's not worth it because it's not straight, and I don't want to have to risk having problems with my glazing on account of that. At this point there's some putty which is got down into the actual joint, which is stopping the frame from going together and being nice and tight like it should be. So I'm going to just heat that up a little bit. Time to loosen now. There we go, that lump of putty there doesn't need to be there, shouldn't be there. Probably the glazing, maybe the glass was too big, or something to do with the way it's repaired at some time. Anyway, that's better. If it's possible to take off this old paint without using heat, then that's what I did. It's just the balance between being able to get the old paint off without breaking the fibres. I don't want to spend a great deal of time softening up paint if it comes off quickly when it's just as it is. This is typical. This frame here has no paint on the sides, and that's quite typical. It shows that the paint that the window was put into the house, not painted, and only the surfaces that were visible were painted. This actual window has never been one that opened. The one that did open has had a very thin coat of paint, but really it is very, very thin, that original coat of paint there. It's quite typical, and I've seen it a lot that that the windows weren't painted on the sides, and I've experimented a bit with that, and I think that it helps to aid in it drying faster. I'm going to mark up a section. There's a knot there. I don't want to get into that. I'm just going to make up a line there. Cut that away, although my clamp's in the way. I'm trying to set it up so that I can film it. Typical difficulty with this is I noticed that a lot of YouTubers have this problem. The camera getting in the way. This damage is on the inside, so it's caused by condensation, not by rain. Quite likely condensation running down the windows, single glass. If I can, I'll have this part at the top of the window instead of at the bottom. I'm just taking the minimum amount I can. It's a bit cack-handed because I fixed it so the camera can see it. Now you might notice that that's a bit sloped. It doesn't matter to me. As long as I get a piece of wood that fits there, I can plane it to the same size as the rest of the wood. Well, this is not sharp, so I'm just going to give it a quick go on the water wheel. I try and, if possible, remember to notice the direction of the growth rings of the wood, and as one would expect, since it's the most traditional way of using exterior wood in Norway, is always the centre of the tree is facing outwards towards the weather. That's the most normal for older buildings. In the newer last 100 years or less, actually really probably just since the 50s, there have been some theories that have gone away from that, but we're going back to that again now, since it was normal before for hundreds of years. Okay. So I need to close it a bit, but not completely. And it closes up. Measure again. That's still a millimetre. I think I got away with it. Check again. It's quite good there. I think I might put a wooden peg through this actually. I mean, they've used a wedge. They've used a wedge there. I wedged it out. Same at both ends. And really that hasn't worked. But on some of them they've used a pin. So, or you know, like a dowel, a wooden dowel. Actually, that seems to have broken off that, so I don't know. I mean, I'm none the wiser really. It's probably better off using screws. I'll have a think about it. And then, because that is at an angle instead of straight, it tightens as you put it in. Tightens against that edge there. There's a tiny little gap just there. That's nice and tight now. That bit there's tight. That gap will probably disappear when I put it under pressure. It's a lot smaller, so put a mark on again to see how deep that's gone. It's supposed to go to 1.8. 0.6, so I think it's already hit something. I'm just going to take that down a little bit on the belt sounder. So that's pretty good. It's 1.85. That's pretty good. So I'm just going to glue that. And that wedge shapedness of it is good for the gluing too, because it's kind of self-tightening. It's right on the limit of what this summer glue can handle, because the operational temperature is +5, I don't know, to +30 or something. And the temperature here today is about 4 degrees, 4 or 5 degrees. Going to be a little bit warmer hitting here. So I'm going to wedge that in and clamp it. There we go. Now, the way this is mounted in the window is with a nail through here. So it's actually going to be held together by its very nature. So that gives it the stability, and it's much stronger now than it would have been with the rotten material. So bearing in mind all of this actually is hidden from view, but I will try and nevertheless make sure that this is at the top of the window and not at the bottom. Partly because the glue is waterproof, and so if you get the same kind of problem with water running down into it, the glue stops it from drying out. Same problem with the paint. So the beauty of wood is that it can get wet and dry out again. I mean, it can't stay wet. As long as it dries out fairly quickly, it won't start rotting. I did think about drilling through the top here and putting a dowel. I think I might actually do that. It's not a bad idea. A wooden dowel that goes down into, so that I'm sure that I'm past the rotten wood. Because obviously it's going to be slightly damaged in the woodwork a bit further in there. But I'll let that set up and dry and cure first. Be adjusted. It's square enough. cut any deeper than that. This is very slightly higher than that, so I'm going to adjust that a little bit. Otherwise the glass doesn't lie quite flat. It's alright at the other end. That's okay. Is that ready for glazing then? A little bit of scraping to do and then it'll be ready for glazing. I'll put some wooden pegs in all of these peg holes. I might drill these out slightly larger. I'll be gluing that piece in. But I'm not sure, I think maybe I have to put that in first. Yeah, that's better to put that piece in first because of the I quite like the way that the craftsman has made this window. The way that they've pegged the corners. They've made a slightly conical hole, and you put one peg on one side and the other on the other, and they have to be slightly sharpened. So that's the right size there. So I just I do this one first. Move that out of the way. I do that one first on that side, and then I'm going to put it through from the other side, where I know the hole is larger. There we go. Put that one back on. Just gluing that peg back in there. Again, that peg's in the way for the fill. Cut those off because the metalwork comes there. Anyway, I'm just going to put that back on there, let that glue, and I'm going to go back to that. Pressed wood glue down into the gap there. And I did the same thing on this one as I did on the first one, and that is I cut a pass with the Japanese saw to take away the putty that had got stuck in this little joint here, which was holding the frame. It was holding the frame apart in that direction, and then using one of these clamps, I just clamped it back together, and that's quite important to do before you put the pins in the corners, especially if you're going to plug the holes first and then repin them. That way we can get it all nice and tight back. And I've checked the opening gap that the glass sits in, and it's 37.2, 37.3, 37.3, 37.3. So that's much more accurate now than it was before I started, so that's very good. This is the middle post. This is my repair. I'm not going to take that off just yet. I don't think it's quite dry. Just thought I'd show you the paint here. The different layers of paint that have gone on here. The oldest layer is very, very thin. You can see that it has hardly any chalk in it. Just pigment and oil. It looks like it was just one layer, one coat of eggshell coloured paint straight onto the wood. And then we have the next layer, has a lot of chalk in it, but it's a linseed oil paint, but it's been thickened up with chalk. And that's also very similar colour. There's a very thin top colour there as well, which looks like perhaps it was done in the same first a kind of filler type coat. It had a lot of chalk in it, followed by a colour coat. But it could just be two separate periods, two separate applications of paint at different times. And then finally, on top, we'll have another thick layer of white paint. Well, it's possible that that's alkyd oil paint, but I don't think so. I think it's based on the crocodile cracking here. But that's a typical sign of linseed oil paint. And then this piece is marked Stueøst. Det Stueøst. So it was in the living room, or the sitting room. Which could probably explain why they're in such good condition, these windows, because if they'd been in the kitchen where there's a lot of condensation because of the cooking inside the kitchen and living, people spend much more time in the kitchen in the past. So the stue, the living room would have been often cold in the winter, in fact, because people tended to reduce the amount of rooms they lived in the winter. And if it was cold, there wouldn't be any condensation really. So, okay, there's a bit of the history of it coming to light. Doesn't look like this. No, it is possible that it was painted with linseed oil before the paint went on the first layer of paint. Not so easy to say. Well, and it could also be that with the first layer of paint, the oil was leached out really by the fibres of the wood, leaving the pigment with slightly less oil. These days people prime with plastic paints, or alkyd oil paints before they use oil paints, but I don't agree with that. I think we can just do it the same as this. We're just with 1 or 2 coats of handmade linseed oil paint. It's pretty simple to make, and I'll make some later for this, so I'll film it. You'll be able to see. Trying to keep it very steady when I do this so as not to rip up the woodwork, and it goes through, and a constant firm pressure, but not very heavy pressure. Trying to get the balance right between pushing down and pulling along. Just really don't want to put enough pressure that even if I go through the paint, I would come through to the fibres of the wood and rip them, which I just don't want to do that at all. But this comes off easily, so pretty easily. So I'm not going to use the heat. I'm going to get rid of most of the oil paint first, because if you heat this up, this thick layer of old oil paint, it gets very gummy. It'll be very gummy and difficult to get off. So I'll take it down to this oldest colour, and then maybe use a bit of heat on that. But the oldest colour, as is typical, it's very well glued to the wood. That is the beauty of the linseed oil paint. It's got such good quality of adherence. This piece of wood has a beautiful curved profile here. So I'm just using one of the corners which has a curved corner on it, because my scraper doesn't have a curve. So to get started, because these little details are very subtle and very beautiful, and so it would be really not a good idea to cut into them. So if this doesn't come off easily, I'd use the heat, but I mean actually it is coming off pretty easily. So. But I will go on and use the heat afterwards, because I just don't want to have to use a lot of pressure to get the paint off, otherwise I might risk banging down into that detail, and damage on that subtle detail there is so obvious and unsightly. I'm not sure if that's good. That's taking up. I might just make a little metal scraper that fits exactly that, because that's a bit too shallow. That's really also a little bit too shallow. So I think I'll just grind a little scraper for that. I had a piece of metal that had a curve on it. It's more like a curve on here. Okay, it's just taking a little bit too much effort to do that, so I'm going to use the heat now for that. Be extra careful now because I've exposed the woodwork. So. Got a little bit of pitting in the surface there, because it's been out in the sunlight, so I'm just using a wire brush. As I've said several times on my films, this grey colour here is caused by fungus, and where it gets a bit of water it'll be grey, and where it just gets sunlight and is very dry it'll be brown or black even. So you can always find out which, I mean this must be from an east facing wall, or northeast at least. These little parts were put on for an inner window. It's quite interesting because sometimes things like little details like this can tell you a lot about the history, because things like these kind of machine-made very small nails, they'll have a very, very particular time at which they were made, you know. So it's a good way of being able to date certain things that have happened. And colour details, which makes me think that this window frame is reused and is much older than the house that it was put into. There's lots of signs here of Empire style or Georgian details. There's this brown colour here, and also the blue colour here. I don't know if it comes out very well on the video or not. Kind of grey blue. This prevents the wood from leaching out the linseed oil from the putty. I'm kind of priming the surface with oil. That should really dry for 24 hours before I do the puttying, which is fine because I've got plenty of work to do cutting out the glass and everything. check that. Yeah, 37.1. So when that's clamped together nice and tight, there's a mismatch with the holes of the original plugs. So I'm going to make larger plugs. For that I'm going to use a stepping drill. So that I get a neat start. These are really good for centralising a hole that's wrong in the first place. That one doesn't need to be so big. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and then I'll make plugs to fit those larger holes. So I'm just going to move this to a slightly different position. I come into a different line of fibres on both I don't want to get too close to here because it makes a conflict with when you do the putty. I don't want it to hit the putty knife. I don't really want the holes to be visible either. But maybe it's better to plug those up as well. I might plug the holes with woodwork first and then do that. I think there might be a little bit of metal down in there. Oh yeah, that's the one that got broken off. Well, I'm just trying to fill up the holes so that they can't kind of fill up with water. I can just kind of more or less put that where I want it. And this is zinc white. Now, zinc white is quite a lot lighter than titanium white. It also doesn't cover as well, and it also cracks more easily. It's not as flexible paint, but it has the wonderful property that it's antiseptic. So I'm going to put roughly the same amount of zinc in, a little bit less by volume than the titanium. I'm just doing it by my judgment. It's about 60%. 60% titanium, 40% zinc. So that looks like quite a lot, doesn't it? But actually, when you start to mix it together with oil, it will sink down. So I could probably fill that right up with oil, actually. I don't want that black bit in there. I'm using a dust mask. So it'll take more oil than that, but that's enough to start with. The correct proportions are around about 60-40, but I mean there isn't any particular science to it, because if you put more zinc in, it's just even more antibacterial. You can see that's starting to thicken up, and also it's sunk right down. But I'm not going to put any more pigment in that because I'm going to use a propeller. I've made a kind of attachment on my pillar drill. This is just a putty knife. Well, this already has probably more oil in it. Well, I can see it definitely has quite a lot more oil in it than you would use if you were making oil paint for painting paintings. Artist quality. I don't think I'm going to add any more oil than that for now. It will need more oil than that. Or maybe not, let's see. The point is that I want to mix it now with my propeller. I need to reset up the camera for that. That looks good. A bit faster. I'm going to now add a little bit of brown. It's I don't know what this is called in English. Brekkfarge it's called in Norwegian. It's like a directly translated from Norwegian. That means break colour, which describes what it does. It breaks the harshness of the white. And this is it's a traditional addition to white paint. Historically, white paints would have been made from lead white, but we don't use that anymore because it's just too poisonous. So I'm going to mix the brown separately from the white because I want to add it in increments. And I'm just going to use a palette knife to do that. A little bit of oil. I might just use a little bit of the white paint. I would just normally leave this running, the white paint mix, while I'm working, but I just switched it off so that it doesn't make too much noise on the video here. I'm going to switch it back on again as soon as I get started. In fact, I might even switch it back on now, and then I'll drop the sound and maybe put some music on because I've got nothing more to say about this. You can just watch me doing it. The reason why I'm mixing it a bit like this is because it makes, I want it to be like a slight emulsion. I don't want it just to be powdery when I put it straight into the white paint, otherwise it takes a lot longer to mix. So that I'm just going to now drop straight into the white. Alright, I don't know if you can see, not sure you can really see it, but I can see the colour change on the wall of the container. The original white colour is further up there, so it's made a substantial difference to the colour. Not really sure it comes across in the video. I'm going to go one little bit darker. So this is the reason why I didn't just mix it in based on weight and quantity and stuff, because I don't, you know, it's a lot of extra work probably, or I mean just even having a reference book or measures or something like that, it just is extra work. I can just see how far I want to go. I'm using a little bit of judgment. I've done it quite often before, so it's just really based slightly on experience, but I mean I'm just putting in a small bit at a time so I can see what happens. Also, a colour change like this is relative. I mean, you're not going to tell. You won't be able to tell when it's on the piece of furniture or, you know, on the window. It just would look like white. It just it's quite subtle. It's going to be the whitest thing around. Even with the brown in it, it's going to be very white. But if it didn't have the brown in it, it would just be too brilliant. The titanium white, it's so incredibly white, much whiter than most things that you're used to seeing. Here's the difference. Look, there's a white thing, cigar box. It's nowhere near as white as the titanium white. It looks more like the colour with the brown paint in it. I don't know if I said what the pigment was. It's raw umber is the pigment. You can also use burnt umber. And the thing about the nice thing about umber is it makes a kind of grey colour. It's not really brown. It looks more grey. You could just use black as well, but black isn't such a good pigment for this because it does tend to float to the surface. With black you really need to grind it, whereas this you can just stir it. I'm just going to leave this running for about half an hour. It's not so easy to see, is it? But there, that is the difference. That's the white, and that's the colour with the umber. And you could just mix in whatever you like. Any combination. And very often when I'm trying to find a colour, I'll just do this kind of thing where you just mix. And you can just choose what you want to try and mimic. That's the pure white. And then different grades of break colour. I don't know what to call it really. So move the camera a bit and you can see the mixture. It's still a bit powdery on the edges where it wasn't mixed. I don't even filter this because when you work it with the brush, I'm using pig bristle brushes, which they need to be pig bristle because the modern synthetic ones aren't really stiff enough. They're too soft. If you're going to use soft brushes, you have to use more thinner. You can just thin this with turpentine, or you could thin it with white spirit as well, but I don't generally do that because it leaves not very nice. Well, it leaves a kind of fat residue in the paint after it's evaporated, which doesn't do the paint any good. Whereas the turpentine evaporates completely. It leaves a trace. Presumably there are traces, but you can't see them. If you leave it on glass and let it evaporate, there's nothing to show that it was there. Whereas if you do that with white spirit, you can see a kind of fatty layer on the glass, which obviously is changing the strength of the paint surface when it's dried in, if you put it into the paint. It's just a bit on the thin side, which would say it maybe could have a slightly more pigment in it. Well, I don't generally paint. I mean, sometimes, the last video I did paint with it unthinned, but I usually thin it a little bit with turpentine because it's easier to apply, and it's difficult to apply this thin enough. The big problem with linseed oil paint is it drips off the surface, and the reason why it does that is because people that have had experience using modern paints are used to them having quite a lot of chalk in them, which makes them more it makes them cheaper to produce, but it also has the added benefit for the end user that it doesn't drip off as easily once you're doing it, once you're painting. But linseed oil paint literally runs off the wall if you put it on too thick. So that's also the other reason for using these stiffer brushes than modern synthetic brushes, because they draw the paint out to a thin layer. So you can achieve just the same thing by putting turpentine in it. So, but you see that surface is it's really good. You don't see, there's a tiny little bit of graininess in the paint, but you just really don't notice it. And if you look at older buildings that have had paint made like this, then they display the same characteristics. So you instantly get a kind of antique look, simply because you're doing the same thing as they used to do. So it's a low-tech way of making paint, which has a tradition certainly that goes back to the 1200s. I'm not aware of them going any back further than that, but I was taught at art school that handworkers were using linseed oil paint about 200 years before artists started using it. So what's that? That's the 1300s, isn't it? Because Leonardo da Vinci used oil paints in about 1500. He was one of the pioneers to start using that. So it smells nice. Has a low toxicity like that. If you mix turpentine in it, it makes it more toxic. I use a gas mask when I paint with the turpentine in it, but it really does help with the ease of application. I then thin this down to the consistency of cream, 11% cream, you know, the kind of cream that you'd have in coffee. Pouring cream. Actually, this is a bit like pouring cream now. So it wants to be a little bit thinner than that for the ease of application. But you don't need the turpentine. The turpentine is just there to make it easier. You don't need it for the strongest paint. I mean, the strongest paint is just the oil and the pigment.